olacak. Kendisinin konuşmasının başlığı zaman, değişim ve tarih, İslam felsefe bilim tarihini değerlendirmenin yolları üzerine başlıklı bir konuşma yapacak. Konuşmasından önce kısaca kendisini tanımak için bahsetmek gerekirse Marmara Üniversitesi İlahiyat Fakültesi mezunu olan doçent doktor Halil İbrahim Üçer, İbrahim Halil Üçer, Mekkil Üniversitesi İslami Araştırmalar Üniversitesi Enstitüsü'nde davetli araştırmacı olarak bulundu. İbn Sina felsefesi hakkında tezini savunmasının ardından İstanbul Medeniyet Üniversitesi Felsefe bölümüne katıldı. İbn Sina ve İbn Sina sonrası İslam felsefesi hakkında çok sayıda makalesi ve İbn Sina felsefesinde Suret, Cevher ve Varlık başlıklı monografisi yayınlanmış olan Üçer, bunun yanında İslam Düşünce Atlası projesinin koordinatörüdür. Aynı adlı kitabın da editörüdür. Üçer konuşmasına kavramların art arda gelişlerinin bize nasıl sürekli ancak çok katmanlı bir düşünce zamanını sunduğunu, İslam felsefesi ve bilimi tarihçiliğinde ve bu yaklaşımın eksikliğini araştırarak yapmayı planlamaktadır. İbrahim Ali Hocam, buyurunuz. Söz sizin.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum Saniye Hocam. Sağ olun, var olun. Ayrıca Mehmet Kuyurtar Hocamın şahsında felsefe bölümü üyelerine, bu programı tertip eden arkadaşlarımıza da hususen teşekkür ediyorum. Felsefe tarihi yazıcılığı meselesi gerçekten Türkiye'de bizim felsefeyi kavrayışımız açısından da hayati bir yerde duruyor. Türkiye'deki felsefecilerin uluslararası ölçekte bir katılımı da hesaba katarak bunu müzakereyi seçmiş olmaları, ümit ediyorum ki ilerleyen dönemde Türkiye'de felsefenin seyri, mahiyeti, bizim felsefi düşünce etkinliğimizin, bugünkü felsefi etkinliğimizin gidişatı açısından da kıymetli sonuçlar doğurur. Benim tebliğimin başlığı zaman, nasıldı? Ben tebliğimin başlığı yeniden tekrar edelim. Zaman, değişim ve şöyle bir an tebliğin başlığı aklımdan çıktı, önümde değil metin. Zaman, değişim ve tarih, İslam düşünce tarihini, felsefe bilim tarihini dönemlendirmenin yolları üzerine. Esasen düşünce tarihçisiyiz birçoğumuz, felsefe tarihçisiyiz. Yaptığımız Türkiye'deki çalışmaların önemli bir bölümü, felsefe tarihinin herhangi bir dönemi üzerine, o dönemdeki felsefe tarihinin temsilcileri üzerine tematik ya da tarihsel bir yolla araştırmalarda bulunmak. Bu başlıkta bir tebliği ayrıntılandıracak bir metni yakın zamanda Düşüncenin Zamanları başlığı taşıyan bir yazıda ele almıştım.
The ideas which I will share here in a recent article. Actually, my question about how to periodize the Islamic history of thought and how we can forge a meaningful relation with the history of thought was departing from this point. What to mean to be a historian of thought, and what means our interest in historiography of thought. There are various philosophers in the philosophy of thought. They have problems, they have ideas, and our curiosity about this, is it just a luxury to be curious about them, or is it an archaeological curiosity which has nothing to do with today's philosophical practices? All these questions were especially important for me. I have devoted more or less my 20 years to this history of science of philosophy. It was actually a search which is triggered by existential concerns. What has my thoughts on history of thought in my today's practice? And if I cannot forge a link between, what does it mean for me? Is it just to collect information, to be a scholar, to satisfy my curiosity? Doesn't it have nothing to do with our today? Of course, when I asked this question, I looked at more deeply to the history in general and to the history of thought in particular, and I think we can have a better conception in this way. My first argument or my first proposition would be, I'd like to invite everyone to deliberate on this. To understand history is to understand now, and to understand today means to understand history. This is valid for all disciplines of history, but when we carry it to the history of thought, actually we see something different. To understand history is to understand today, because looking from the point of view of the history of thought, the terminological frameworks and conceptual grounds which are guiding our today's deliberations had been formed within a given language, and it has settled on our memory. And actually we are departing from this ground while deliberating on today. As Analysis Historical School or the Analian historians speak of the structures and thoughts, actually we can speak about such a multi-layered structure in the history of thought. Let's remember, events happen in short times, and they are corresponding to the historical cases with limited influence area, but thoughts have longer domains which can be followed for a few centuries in the history. For example, a war given by a king, having a child of a king, succession of kings, they are historical events. They are interesting in terms of their periods, but if we take into account the processes, which is different from this, there are some processes of change which have a bearing on the wider human life. And these processes might be actually meaning an effect area which has not reflected on today. But also Braudel speaks of structures, as is known, structures
oluşumlarını andıran uzun süreler içerisinde gerçekleşen değişimler teşekkül etmiş bu yapılar
structures which had been occurred as a result of this will not stay where they are. They will come to here. The structures have reflections on today, and they have bearings on our daily life of today, from politics to philosophy, from morality to other domains. They come here. They don't stay there. Structures come here. And we will be speaking of a multi-layered structure in the history of thought too. Yeah, thought has a historical aspect. They are also ephemeral. A theory argued by a scientist or a philosopher might have assumed a function, and they might stay there. We might find longer effective thoughts, but also we can find some frameworks which have not remained in history, but settled in our today's way of thought. If this is right, our thought activity is based on certain infrastructures which are reflected through the history. If this is right, if this is so, to understand history means to understand today or now. To think on the history of thought means to reckon or give the account of the historical ideas which are guiding today. That is why to understand history means to understand today, on the condition that this multi-layered structure is taken into account. But on the other hand, to understand now means to understand history, because the thought historians' interest, retrospective interest, if this interest is not accompanied by a curiosity about now, the history of thought cannot be anything more a philological scholarship. For example, think of Islamic education historian who is working on madrasa. If he does not have a question about now, about what is education now and what means education now, in this way he can, if not, he cannot understand what madrasa is means then. Or historian of thought who has studied Avicenna, if he has not a curiosity about now, he can only depict what Ibn Avicenna had told about mind. Even it might be impossible for him to understand it, to conceive it. Of course, to understand history means to understand today, but we cannot have a thought historiography independent of the curiosity towards today. Otherwise, it cannot provide us with the possibility of understanding the historical structures neither in past nor today. And history of thought, if it is vital in terms of understanding today, can we speak about a right way to tackle with it? What is the right way to do this? Yes, history is closely related to time. It's not past. Its subject topic is not past because it's a rationalized past. Even if it is time, even history is tackling with time, we are speaking about different times. For example, astronomical time of the world, we are speaking about geological time, biological time, etc. Human time or humanistic time, natural time, which is getting beyond of the natural times, which is interfering with it. To multiply the examples, the history of politics looks at how human wills change and transform these natures, and we can focus on this time, so on and so forth. And what about the history of thought? On what time do history of thought focus on? To answer this, I have to first make a conventional definition of time without going into details of the discussions related to the description of time. Aristotle said that time is the number of change. Based on this definition, let me ask the question, what is the time of history of thought? Yes, time is the count or number of the change. The successive changes give us the idea of time. For example, worlds rotating around sun in a periodical, repetitive and traceable patterns is the astronomical time of the world. The numbers of the chains. That number of chains means year. That number of chains means seasons, days, and so on and so forth. We conceptualize and denominate them, and in this way we can have a chronology. On the other hand, the change in the geological time of the world determines the geological time of the world. The internal source in our biological being creates some biological time, such as infancy, old age, youth, and so on. And this is also what we count in time. It's biological time, it's world's time, and we have also human time, which exists in the natural being, but which in a way dominates over this and transforms it. And what is the time of history of thought? If time is the number of change, what will the historian of thought will count? Frankly speaking, the discipline of history of thought once did not exist, and in those times we didn't have the idea that history of thought included big transformations. For example, Farabi's or Neo-Platonists thinkers, philosophy means the real thought, true thought, and its truth means that it doesn't change. For example, from Aristotle to Farabi, regardless of religious, language, culture, geography, and historical conditions, they continue for thousands of years. And the idea that philosophers should reiterate the same truth sees philosophy free from these sorts of change. So we will not be seeing a history of thought in the past. So the texts which we are seeing as history of philosophy are mostly biobibliographical works. Let's look at the Genesis or the index, Tabakatul Etiba. The philosopher is told, his life is accounted, and his works are shared. They don't treat how thoughts changed. Especially, it is thought that there might not be a change in thoughts because philosophers became philosophers when they had a definite conception after they arrived at this major thought. And this opinion cannot see history of thought as change of ideas. Of course, as of 18th century, we have the other idea following the scientific revolutions. We don't think anymore like that. Let's come back to the time of thought. Time of thought is time of changes. But change in what? For example, the change in politics will not measure the history of thought. For example, 13th year Islamic thought. We are pointing to a certain moment of transformation in Islamic philosophy, but we are giving it a name as the 13th century because a chronological name becomes a label for a thought. Maybe it can associate, it can evoke something in our minds, but actually, in order to measure the time of change, we need other things. First, we have to answer this question. What changed in order to create a time of the thought? Of course, ideas or terms which are expressing thoughts. Arthur Gordon, who had created the area of ideas, in the preface of his work, he used the term unit ideas, such as God, universe, truth, human, knowledge, value, and so on. These are the basic ideas on which the humans thought through their history. These terms, these unit ideas, can be called also as ground terms. I call them as ground terms. And the ground terms are the grounds on which the chains in thought occur. That's why I call them ground thoughts. For example, God. We can speak of the term God for the Greek philosophy or for Mazdaism. For philosophy of Islam, we can always speak of the term of God, which is the principle of the plurality and which is the constructive principle. It is a ground term. It can be called Theos, Ilah, or other names. It assumes new expressions, but it expresses, in any case, the ground of thought for humanity. The chains which reveal the time of the thought realizes on this grounds. But what to change these ground terms, just as Aristotle tells about formation of the substance into forms, this ground also forms the terms and lends them new meanings, and we can call them the founder terms, constructive terms. The ground terms are common in all cultures, but when they are saved from the indefiniteness, they become definite, and these are the founder ideas. For example, when we speak about the God in Greek philosophy, what determines the term of God is, for example, unchanging being or causal independence, self-sufficiency. These are founder terms, autartes. The gods being self-sufficient. When something loses this, it's not God anymore. For a Greek, God means something which doesn't need anything else, which is self-sufficient, or the unmoving mover. For example, why it doesn't move? Because motion needs something, or motion creates a need. But God can be imagined as something which is completely self-sufficient. Also, in the Islamic thought, what founds or builds the term God is the will. Even if when you ask anyone in Turkey, what do you understand of God, he or she will say that an omnipotent being, which has power for everything. In Greek, it is self-sufficiency, to be sufficient for oneself. But in Islam, it is about to be strong, about to have power on everything, omnipotency. So I call them, as I said, founder terms, and how these founder terms are building ground terms. Okay, let's assume that we have founded them, we have constructed them. For example, Islamic theologians, Kalam theologians, will define it with omnipotency, but the Greek will express it with self-sufficiency. And how will we explain that God is self-sufficient? There are some semantic formations, which I call semantic components grounds. According to me, there are principal semantic or primary ones and the secondary ones, or the other ones in these principles. God is a ground term and self-sufficiency is the founder term. By protecting God as a self-sufficient principle, how can we make it the principle of plurality? We answer this with a theory. It's called, for example, Sudur theory. Sudur theory illustrates how self-sufficient God can be a principle for plurality. It is an illustrative principle. There are main principles of pseudo theory. Then, if we ask the question, how can we prove pseudo theory in a consistent way? Pseudo theory becomes in this way the primary semantic principle. And how can we rationalize it? How can we justify it? How can we prove it? How can we express it in a philosophical language?
Bakıyoruz. Aristotelesçi akıllar
For example,
teorisi.
if you look at Farabi, the Aristotelian principles theory, Ptolemaic theology, and Neoplatonian theory are brought together to make pseudo a reasonable theory as of its terms. It's not unmoving motions doctrine, nor a Ptolemaic doctrine, nor Neoplatonianism constitute the essence of pseudo. They are actually components. They are complementary. Let's remember the layers. The ground term is God. The founder term, which makes the ground term, which distinguishes the ground term from the others, self-sufficient. Pseudo answers the question how a self-sufficient being can be ground for the plurality, for semantic components, and the historical framework which illustrates this semantic principle is the historical and scientific framework which allows us rationalizing the pseudo theory. We three well look at this picture. Let's go back to the beginning. In terms of today's way of thought, the term fate or destiny, what does it mean? What does it mean that in the middle of the desire is the God? What does it mean the perfection of the circular motion? What about the idea of a discrete mind which is governing the whole universe, or the idea of universe? What do they mean? In this or that way, they are archaic terminologies which is protected. They sometimes tend to direct our today's effectiveness. Let's remember back of Braudel. Are they some ephemeral things like events, or are they main ideas which deserve to come here? Or think of pseudo. For us, pseudo was seeming like a semantic principle for explaining a founder term. Pseudo protected, pseudo remained in the history of thought for a long while, but if we ask what is the principle of universe, should we use pseudo or emanation? These are the grounds which carries the grounds in the history of thought. They are founder terms. They are founder terms which are illustrating the other ones, and they allow us to distinguish the semantic components. And actually, which components are fitting in a historical aspect, which components have a structure like continuity, can be deliberated over this. Let me give a striking example. How much time do I have? 7 minutes. For example, the idea of nefs or self. Immaterial, the idea of conscious, the understanding of an immaterial spirit. This understanding about nefs or self appears to be the joint acceptance of Islamic thinkers. We have a body, we have a spirit, and it is not bodily at all, it is completely immaterial. That idea became so effective that in the history of Islam, somebody who considers himself or herself as a part of this idea cannot understand the humanitarian whole independently from this idea. When they come face to face with a reductionist or other theory, a mind which had been imbued with this idea of nafs or self or immaterial spirit, this can be seen in such a way. Why? The thought that spirit is immaterial for a Muslim, and it is an indispensable part of this. For example, it's about the proof of the nubuwwet, the prophecy, or proof of that prophet shows miracles. In all these issues, this idea is very important. Almost it is like the unity of the God, and it's like proving nubuwwet or prophecy. But if we look at the history of thought from the framework which I have drawn about the ground terms and the founder terms, semantic principles, this will show us that actually immaterial understanding of spirit came to fore in the 13th century. Before this, at least Kalam theologians did not have this. It was not used in terms of proving prophecy or prophethood. It had been accepted because it was instrumental in proving prophethood. After this, it was thought to be instrumental in terms of understanding this. It's not a founder term. The immaterial soul or immaterial spirit is not a founder term or a ground term. It is actually an explanatory term. For example, a founder term might be eternity or immortality. It is, immortality is an founder term, but this assumption is actually used for illustrating the immortality, but it had been accepted so strongly that it is treated as a structure and it is shaping our today. Without deliberating on all these layers retrospectively, without putting forward their positions, we cannot reckon or we cannot make an accountancy of today's thought. Finally, such a reading can be instrumental in terms of periodizing the history of thought. The attempt for periodizing the history of thought, unfortunately, mostly have some politic aspects because of Eurocentric tendencies and because that we have problems in terms of attempting to make a meaning out of non-Western schools of thought. In such an environment, as a way to cope with this problem, a history of thought which has a historical framework. How can we periodize it? According to which periods? What means continuation and what means change for this? All these questions can be also answered from the point of view of the layered thought, which I exposed, because the attempt or the effort for understanding rhythm of this might be instrumental. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you very much. You ended punctually. Now I am switching to English.
Okay, so I am honored and very happy to introduce our next speaker, Professor Aditya Nigam, who is a professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. Professor Nigam's main areas of interest are political philosophy and social theory, especially in the context of Marxist theory. He is a co-author of the book entitled Power and Contestation in India since 1989, and the author of another book entitled Decolonizing Theory Thinking Across Traditions. Professor Nigam has written on various subjects such as decolonialism, discursive formations, and the emergence of political subjectivities in the non-Western countries. Today, the title of his talk is, he's going to give a talk entitled Time and Revolution in the Global South, and he will focus on the question of how theory encounters time, especially how historical materialism encounters historical time in the context of the underdeveloped worlds of the Global South. Professor Nigam, the floor is virtually yours.
I'm sorry to have missed the initial part. Thanks a lot. There was some technical glitch in getting in, but let me not now waste time. With thanks to everybody and to my previous speaker. I'll start. Can you? Sorry. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Professor. We can hear you and we can see you.
Okay. So I'll just start by saying that actually I was listening to the earlier presentation, and the way in which I'm going to be talking of time is more about historical time, not time in its metaphysical sense. Though I think the question of periodization also kind of overlapped in a sense with historical time as well in the earlier talk. And though my primary reference in this reference point here is Marxism, more correctly the field of Marxism, the argument that I propose to make will concern the larger question of modernity's understanding of time, but Marxism itself was constituted by it. I want to make two quick preliminary points at the outset. The first concerns the idea of what I'm calling the field of Marxism. I use the word field here in the sense in which scientists understand a gravitational field or an electromagnetic field, where bodies behave in specific ways, impacting on other bodies, often without even coming into physical contact with each other. This field of Marxism is produced by the encounter between Marxism on the one hand and the underdeveloped parts of the global south on the other. And a further point here needs to be borne in mind. Marxism in these parts, our parts of the world, was not the name of a fully formed doctrine or body of theories about capitalism and the modern working class, but was understood more generally as a call to arms to the oppressed people of the world. In the context of colonialism and following the Russian Revolution, it provided a discourse of anti-colonialism for emerging movements against colonizing powers of the modern West. The second related point concerns the fact that most often the working class, or the peasantry, or indigenous populations were not understood to be inhabiting three different chronologically ordered modes of production: primitive communist, pre-capitalist, which could be feudal, Asiatic mode or whatever, and then the capitalist. In other words, they were not seen as inhabiting three different times, but often understood in very generic terms as the oppressed people. And it should be, of course, borne in mind that in actual material terms too, they were often not very different from each other. Unlike the modern proletariat that came into being in the West following the complete liquidation of pre-capitalist agrarian communities, in many countries of the global South, the workers were drawn from the peasantry as well as from indigenous communities. In India, for example, even today, this is so. Workers in modern industries are still peasants, just as segments of workers in mining and related industries are recruited from indigenous communities. In India, for example, even this itself poses serious theoretical issues, not just for historical materialism, but also for modernity's time understanding of time itself. For it too had long relegated all these life forms to the status of remnants or survivals of the past. It is moreover a question that has appeared repeatedly within the history of Marxism, right from the time when Otto Bauer and the Austro-Marxists raised it in the first decade of the 20th century. When he remarked in the Austro-Hungarian remark that in the Austro-Hungarian Empire monarchy, there are examples of all economic forms to be found in Europe, including Turkey. Consequently, said Bauer, what exists in the international as chronological development takes place simultaneously in Austria, and that is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This question of what we can call non-synchronous synchronicities or contemporaneity of non-contemporaneous after Ernest Bloch was simply registered, but never taken up at a theoretical or philosophical level. The question of non-synchronous synchronicities has repeatedly confronted historical materialism, but has still not been accounted for.
Mr. Nigam, yes? Interpreter is speaking. Can you speak a bit closer to the microphone? It's really hard to hear you. Can you speak a bit closer to the microphone?
Okay, let me see if I can.
Could you please speak again? No, it's not working at the moment.
We can't hear you, unfortunately.
Okay, I think I'll just have to try. Is this okay?
Yes, this is better, I think.
Okay.
Better, thank you.
Okay. So this is what I'm exploring today. What I'll be presenting is work in progress. So much of what I'm saying is necessarily tentative. In a peculiar reversal of fate, we not only saw the collapse of actually existing socialism and its replacement by capitalism at the end of the 20th century. In that period, in the period that followed, we also saw the virtual decimation of the working class and the peasantry and indigenous populations coming center stage. The peasantry and indigenous populations coming center stage. The working class, in the sense of an uncontaminated modern entity with no links to pre-modern communities and tied solely to modern capitalist industrial production, has not only lost political efficacy, but has been rapidly decimated due to two kinds of circumstances. One, the relocation of major industries. I mean, this is not things I want to go into any great detail here, but as industries from the global north relocated to the global south, that working class actually kind of moved out. And what we have in the sweatshops of China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia are precisely workers who are peasants also, or workers who are indigenous people also. The second is the new round of technological revolution that has started with the advent of computer and internet and is now moving apace, displacing labor thanks to artificial intelligence. In contrast, we realize that even today, over 60% of the global population still survives and it earns its livelihood from agriculture. And this population has been increasing, at least in absolute numbers, despite massive dispossession and takeover of agricultural land worldwide. With the frenetic pace of neoliberal development over the last 3 decades, we have seen the sharpening of conflicts worldwide where peasantry and indigenous populations emerged as the key foci of anti-capitalist resistance. Indeed, very soon after the collapse of socialism, we saw the emergence of the first international peasant organization, La Via Campesina, and the Zapatista rebellion in the Chiapas region of Mexico. But it soon turned out that these were not isolated instances. In fact, the new Latin American left also took rebirth in this period with its primary social base among the indigenous populations rather than the working class. These new left formations are not quite obviously invested in the stagist imagination of the historical materialist kind, and though one can argue that there are still remnants of a modernist outlook there. I'm not going into that part, and that empirical question is, I'm shelving that. That's not for our discussion today. In order to pose my problem even more sharply and concretely, let me go back to the collapse of socialism briefly. We know that the event of the Russian Revolution had presented a major conundrum before Marxism that had all along expected the revolution to take place in mature industrial societies of Europe. This is a very commonplace knowledge, prompting Antonio Gramsci to even label it the revolution against class capital. In Russia, he had written Marx's Capital was more a book of the bourgeoisie than of the proletariat, for it stood as a critical demonstration of how events should follow a predetermined course, how capitalism and the bourgeoisie had to first develop before the proletariat could think of its own revolution. Later, Marxists understood it, following Lenin, by displacing it from the economic stagism of the historical materialist problematic in terms of the political theme of the weakest link. And the argument was that therefore with the emergence of imperialism, the chain of oppression could only be broken where the link was the weakest. In the 1960s, Louis Althusser theorized this in terms of the category of overdetermination, or the idea of fusion of a number of contradictions. Practical Marxism, however, took a different route. Because the question remained a purely practical one, and because the question of worker-peasant unity was merely strategic without any theoretical basis, from its very first moments, the revolution could not but turn against the peasantry. And the idea was that even though the revolution had to be made as pure contingency in a backward country, the building of socialism required a highly developed industrial civilization. Thus, theses of primitive socialist accumulation were advanced, and the peasantry was generally squeezed for the sake of heavy industrialization. China fared no better, though the peasantry had some respite during the Mao years, because Mao was opposed to the decimation of agriculture. Walking on two legs, that is industry and agriculture, in his words, would have to be the Chinese way. With the collapse of socialism, however, many Marxists started questioning the rationale of making a revolution in a backward state. The historical materialist idea of succession of stages was also clearly running into problems at other levels. So Gramsci talks of passive revolution, initially to account for a backward agrarian South in Italy, in comparison to the industrial North. But his discussion in the prison notebooks leaves us in no doubt that he was reading practically the entire history of Europe since the French Revolution as a passive revolution. That is to say, nowhere does it appear that the bourgeoisie is strong enough on its own to do away with feudalism, and it is the state that therefore takes on the strategy of transformism to build capitalism. In retrospect, this should alert us to the possibility that there was actually no immanent necessity that drove all human societies towards capitalism. And the other level at which the historical materialist problematic encountered serious difficulty is in the debate that went on in the global South during the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s. Starting with the dependency debate in Latin America and its mode of production variant in Asia and Africa, with many overlaps, of course. And the question generally boiled down to determining the extent of capitalist development in these societies and the reasons for their underdevelopment. which in turn led to prolonged arguments regarding how to understand these societies, where a small though powerful industrial sector coexisted for very long stretches of time alongside a sprawling rural hinterland with pre-capitalist social relations. One of the ways of dealing with this contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous was to invoke Marx's famous distinction between formal subsumption of labor under capital and the real subsumption, and argue that from the 16th century on, with the emergence of world capitalism, all parts of the world have become integrated into one capitalist system, even if large parts retain their old production relations. Therefore, they are all capitalists. This really does not tackle the theoretical problem at hand. We cannot go into the details of the debate here, but suffice it to note that the key question here too was of understanding the coexistence of more than one mode of production. That would obviously throw any idea of any internal logic of transformation into crisis. And the solution adopted by a large number of Marxists was through the enunciation of the concept of a social formation that was seen as a combination of more than one mode of production. A social formation was understood to be a structure in its own right that came into being through an articulation of different modes of production, but it could only be a transitional form, for within the larger logic of immanent laws of historical development, it was difficult to visualize a permanent situation of coexistence or co-presence. Thus, within this structure of social formation, it was capitalism that was understood to provide the dominant logic, ensuring that eventually it would fully replace the pre-capitalist forms and emerge as the endpoint of the transition. The difficulty, however, was that in many cases, this period turned out to be so long as to have no meaning as a transition. You can't have a permanent transition, right? So the question eventually arose as to whether there was any such destiny or telos in the first place. At this point, it may not be out of place to also mention that for the late Marx too, his investigations into Russian, Indian, and other Oriental societies and the forms of peasant property therein were pushing him to question the idea of capitalism, inevitability of capitalism. Not only that, they were also forcing him to reconsider the idea that all older social forms with their communal ownership of property were necessarily regressive. Now I come to the last part of my presentation where I'm drawing some of the implications of this. Now, if this is the scenario as far as the practical experience goes, certain implications follow. First, the idea of a telos of history where capitalism is a necessary stage, overcoming or liquidating other stages, is not borne out by experience. Secondly, the idea of history as linear development is thrown into crisis. Indeed, after the collapse of socialism and the reappearance of the peasantry or indigenous peoples on the historical stage, we could say with the late Althusser that the reality of the accomplished fact is no guarantee of its durability. History to him was nothing but the permanent revocation of the accomplished fact by another undecipherable fact about which nothing can be said in advance. In other words, there is no permanence to anything in history, and there is no determined logic by which we can understand its permanence or its durability. Third, the concept of the social formation as yet another economic structure or totality does not provide a satisfactory way of understanding the problem of non-synchronous synchronicity. At this point, I want to return to my earlier reference to Althusser's enunciation of the concept of overdetermination in his attempt to grapple with what he called the unevenness of origins and the difficulty of accounting for it through the idea of a simple totality with a single present. And that was governed by, therefore, a single logic or a single contradiction like capital and labor. It is well known that Althusser made this key move of elaborating the idea of a complex Marxist totality by drawing on Mao Zedong's writings, where the latter was already talking of a multiplicity of contradictions, hence principal contradiction and secondary contradictions. Mao's multiplicity of contradictions left no room for a single contradiction to play the determining and divisive role. Any idea of a present, therefore, was always already complicated, and it was never a single. So that is why, in fact, the problem with periodization is also that you can never have a slice of time where you can say a particular period ends and a new period begins, because there are always these continuities through different epochs of time. So it is well known that, so Mao's multiplicity of contradictions leave no role for that. What is more, there was always a possibility in his schema of a secondary contradiction under certain conditions coming to the fore and becoming the principal one. This could not happen within the enclosed logic that was purely internal to the economy. This was where the politics and struggle entered the scene. We know that Mao undertook this exercise in order to argue that China, which was far more backward than Russia had been, could actually skip the capitalist stage of development and go over to socialism directly. This required that the historical materialist schema inherited from European Marxism be suitably amended. So essentially, decades later, that is the project Althusser embarks upon. In the Marxism of Althusser, we find a clear effort to recast the paraphernalia of historical materialism in such a way that the lonely hour of the last instance of the economy never arrived. The idea of overdetermination served precisely that purpose and made it possible to argue that because the economic level was never active alone in its pure, unadulterated state, and there was no saying in advance what the course of history would be. We can push this point much further. After all, it is entirely possible that ideology, culture, traditions inflect the course and even the formation of the economy, and politics ensures that the real site of historical drama shifts or moves to the conjuncture rather than the structure. Althusser's discourse in this period does not frontally challenge the basic Marxist concepts like mode of production and determination in the last instance by the economy. In his later writings on the philosophy of encounter, however, he begins to see the mode of production as a contingent combination of the elements that constitute it where it may or may not take, I would like to conclude this discussion by briefly referring to the question of mode of production as it appears in the debates, in one of the debates referred to earlier. In the mode of production debate, one of the issues of contention was regarding how to identify capitalist relations in agriculture. If one goes through the various positions elaborated by different scholars, and there or in the Morris Dobb, Paul Sweezy transition debate, or in the Brenner debate, it is evident that Marxist scholars have had great difficulty in agreeing on what constitute capitalist relations, especially in agriculture, that is in the non-industrial sector. In fact, there is no agreement. In opposition to the general tendency to identify existence of wage labor with capitalist relations, Indian scholar Jairus Banerjee, in an early intervention, had argued that it was wrong to identify forms of exploitation or labor relations, which is what wage labor was, with the mode of production. A specific form of exploitation, such as wage labor, could in principle be found in any mode of production, even in ancient times. A no less serious issue of contention among scholars working on the transition question has been the difficulty in characterizing the pre-capitalist economy from which capitalism is said to have emerged. Since that is now largely accepted, it is now largely accepted that feudalism was a form specific to Western Europe. looking at the wide variety of forms prevalent across the world, Banerjee concludes that agrarian capitalism did take radically different forms even within different countries, and that the entrenched idea that England's history supplies us with the archetype of capitalist agriculture is a myth. In his subsequent research, backed by historical research from many other parts of the world, Banerjee has more recently stated this argument more forcefully, but in the process, he flounders when it comes to determining what the formations that display such variations in both capitalist as well as pre-capitalist relations really are. It seems as if the larger question of the mode of production becomes a conundrum eventually. The more he confronts the diversity of labor relations and forms of exploitation. Since his own theoretical proclivities are quite orthodox, Banerjee seems allergic to any suggestion of co-presence of different modes. This is not the place for a detailed discussion on the issue, but it seems, and I'll conclude with this, it seems to me that everything in his work points to the fact that the category of the mode of production is an unnecessary imposition that is at the root of the problem. We can indeed visualize different social formations comprising different combinations of a variety of labor regimes and forms of exploitation held together not by any economic logic of the mode of production or social formation, but through the contingent formations of political power. If that is so, I suggest that the co-presence of the worker, the peasant, and the indigenous too must be seen as not seen as representing backwardness and different modes of production, but rather, and therefore as mere survivals, but rather we need to see these societies of the global south as embodying specific combinations of different forms of labor whose relative importance can change over time, as we have seen above in the case of the working class and the peasantry. I conclude.
Thank you very much for your illuminating talk, Professor Nigam. So now we can open the floor for discussions and for questions from the audience. There is a question to Professor Üçer, so I'm going to switch to Turkish to raise that question.
Mr. Ibrahim, a question to you from Özgür Soysal. First of all, thank you. Your presentation was very, I learned a lot from your presentation. In this framework, you said that the historical and structural components can be differentiated. So, I would like to ask you, can we interact this approach of you with other post-constructivist contemporary approaches? Actually, both constructivism and both post-constructivism, to compass all of them, actually. The things I talked about, the truth perspectives are far away from that. So the transformation moments in science history are actually mostly are analyzing, monitoring, and examining the reasons behind this transformation in political, economical, and social and geographical impacts are analyzed in these transformation moments. So in this point, actually, I think they are beautiful instruments, but this constructivism can provide us some opportunities because they provided us some different perspectives. But actually, for me, the post-constructivism perspective, how can I put it? The post-constructivist approach cannot be interacted in aside from logos, for example, only analyzing the structures being changed and also keeping them, by analyzing them, by keeping them aside from the logos, I think this approach sometimes brings something to us, but it also makes us to lose something. So what will we lose from that? I would like to ask to myself too about that. So in this framework, about these ground definitions as I made, actually they are mostly related with, not only related with the things as the post-constructivists do, to evaporate the truth or to leave the truth behind. It doesn't underline this fact. I don't have this emphasis. God, human, universe, or these ground definitions, basic definitions or unit ideas, they are all actually for the in different terms, in different times, social relations feeding this political and economic impact. They are not something built outside this structure. So what can I say? Actually, they are the relationship of human with truth outside the mind and the things they catch from the truth to define and name them actually is not historical, they say, or these definitions can vary from culture to culture, but different human communities are trying to catch the same truth unit. Actually, I think they are born from these efforts, I can say. So if we take this into consideration, this interaction is possible, but without calculating this interaction, we just, I think, first of all, think about the emphasis I have brought in my presentation. I think it's a danger for us to make it to be too interactive with the other post-constructivist approach, like God, human, the definition of them, the definition of the good and evil, or they are unit definitions of basic units. So they are not only a structure, or they are not a conceptual construction for me. So they have human aspects, or but there are also things that emerge or that push these definitions to emerge. I think I say this perspective can be also it can give us a different look, yes, but that's all. Thank you. Maybe you can ask, but we can talk about it later, maybe.
Teşekkür ederiz cevabınız için de.
Thank you.
Sıradaki soru Profesör Aditya Nigam'a.
The next question is to Professor Aditya Nigam. Now I am going to English channel.
Professor Nigam, the next question is for you. Can you elaborate on how you would relate to countries like China and India, how you would consider their status to the world capitalism when we analyze the characteristics of the southern hemisphere in terms of Marxist classification? So basically, belki çevirmenin çevirisi daha güzel olacaktır. O yüzden ben çevirmene de mi bıraksam soruyu diye düşündüm bir yandan.
Ben zaten çevirdim.
Ha, tamam.
So it's your turn. The question is to you, Mr. Aditya. But can you please talk a bit slower? And if you want, I can repeat the question to you again.
Yes, no, I got the question. Is it complete? That was what I was asking.
That's good. That's good then.
Okay. No, the thing is, actually, it will become a very big discussion because I have been working on the question of capitalism for a very long time now. And I no longer believe that there is one single mode of production or one single capitalist system across the globe. And I have one of the key concepts with which I've been trying to work is the concept of the outside. The way in which the global South has been reduced to an appendage of the West is to say basically that our destinies are already determined. If there is one global totality, then there is one single present, and that present is there in the West. And what we are all have to be by necessity some part of the past. You can only break this by breaking the idea of the totality, by breaking the idea that there can be one single present in what you call the globe, whether you call it world history, whether you call it world capitalism, whether you call it world systems, whatever name you want to give it is not the point. But if the idea is that there is no outside to modernity, there is no outside to capitalism, then we are basically doomed to be following that particular path. Now, as it happens, it is true that what the Peruvian theorist Aníbal Quijano says, coloniality of power, and that even after colonialism is over, the structures of power which have been bequeathed to us are such that post-colonial regimes also follow that same logic. They also want to be still like the West, but that does not necessarily mean that there is some internal logic to it. This is part of the way in which that A, the coloniality of power is structured, B, it is also to do with the way in which there is a complete philosophical gap. We have actually till now not been able to philosophically challenge the philosophy of world history, which in different form exists from Marx, from Hegel to Marx. That is something which more or less we continue to abide by and more or less continue to follow. And so when I look at a country like India or a country like China, I think that these are complex formations which are constituted by their nature of political power there. This is nothing to do with all India, by the some global capitalism or something. It is the nature of political power in China, which had a revolution. There was a communist party, and then that communist party started going into building some parts which seem like restoration, some kind of capitalism developing within socialism. Some parts it looks like there is no socialism at all, and so on. In India also it is a similar case, though it was not a communist party here and we never actually had that kind of radical land reforms and so on. But it is not like India is destined to follow the path that the West has already staked out, because we are not part of that, a single totality. That is where how I would answer it in short. Otherwise, of course, we can have a longer discussion on this.
Thank you very much. The next question is to Professor Üçer in Turkish. Hocam, size bir soru gelmiş İbrahim Hocam. Zemini
Mr. Ibrahim, another question to you. You have talked about the ground basic definitions, how we can find the ones which claim that they are the ground definition, how we can find a pure definition. Şükrü Argan asked about that. Thank you, Mr. Şükrü. I couldn't see the question now, but this is an important question. actually this is about the points we have to take into consideration about layering the multi-layered basic definitions. For example, the things which are not related with matter. For example, soul, it is a basic definition, unit definition. It is not a founding definition. If we replace it, it is as a founding definition. It is an indispensable element of your present. Actually, when you go away from this definition, you are going away this tradition. But it is not like that. When you are aware of that, this definition is not a basic one. When you see it, you try to find some proof for it. So you reach to an understanding for finding other proofs for it. So let's think about, for example, being infinite or finding eternal, something eternal. It is still the relationship between them. There is a differentiation for me. There's a difference between these definitions. The basic or ground definitions actually are definitions which do not vary according to from culture to culture. We can say, I can say, so they are equal to the ideas, unit ideas. For example, God. Why I understand the definition or God, it is a huge thing. It's as Aristotle said, it is not something shaped by a form. It just implies to a principle. For example, God. So when you ask what is God, what is human, when we think about that, it is a we can then ask lots of questions then. So even if they change from language to language, their conceptual meaning doesn't change. So for example, love, you can keep aside love of God, but you cannot leave God as a definition there. So they can still protect themselves. The point when we confuse about the founding definitions, the founding definitions can change from culture to culture, from philosophy schools to other schools. They can be supported with other definitions, yes, or founded, we can say. But for that, about these being multiple layers, can give us about the way to define the truth, for example. It is something we can mention for all societies. But when we ask what is the truth, then we talk about the definitions which are asking questions to this formation, to this structure. For example, good, it is a ground definition, but when we ask what is good, this ground definition is actually being clarified with this founding definition. But I also want to say that they coexist actually. In the phenomenal point, they have to be understood like that. So it is something which is passive, we can say, or it is not something passive. If there is God, there is the imagination of God, or there is a definition of it. So it is actually about making an abstract way of defining them according to the truth, according to Aristotle, or the truth according to Plato. Define, of course, change. For example, there are ways to differentiate each other, I can say. I hope of course, we can find different ways for that, but it is the pragmatic solution, I can say, to make a difference between them. Thank you so much.
Bu sefer Profesör var.
Another question to Professor Aditya Nigam. So, how we can talk about a divided globalization phenomena between the North and South. For example, the strange thing in the definition of global South, how we can you describe it a bit more, let's say?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting and good question, because global South is not really a satisfactory expression. We are using it as a kind of shorthand expression to the earlier terms had very specific context. So third world was actually counterposed to the first world and second world. That doesn't exist anymore. So the third world in itself doesn't mean anything. Then for some time we talked of the post-colonial world. But what we are talking of as the global South, not every part of the world was actually colonized in the same way or even colonized. So China, for example, not really colonized in the way in which India was colonized, right? So there are actually variations in that. And even more important is the question of the settler colonial countries. So even though US, we will usually not put in global South, but the Native American populations and the African Americans in the US are global South, in the sense that they are the ones who were the original Native Americans in America and Canada and other places were actually the original inhabitants. These others were settlers. African Americans were brought in. So actually, if you start disaggregating it, it is very difficult to stick to a satisfactory, to define global South in satisfactory terms. So that is why I would not, beyond saying that it is a placeholder, that till we come across a better term, or we can invent a better term for it. Right now we are using it, but it does not mean that there is some singular logic which ties the global South together. It is not, at least in a positive sense. What has happened is that there are these highly diverse, heterogeneous societies, even inside one country, one African country, or one India. Likewise, I'm sure Turkey. Everywhere the diversity is much, much more than you can actually tie it, that would allow you to tie it into one particular definition. But right now we are kind of making do with that kind of a homogenized understanding of nation states. But that is obviously not something one will theoretically or philosophically be able to justify or stand by. So I would say that the globalization logic is a northern logic. It is a logic which is propelled by a certain kind of technological development and a neoliberal push towards opening up borders for free trade and so on and things like that, or to capture markets or capture biodiversity, biopiracy. All that was what was globalization about. Globalization was about. So I would not actually use the term globalization in that kind of positive way, unless the way in which the World Social Forum at one time was using it as a kind of globalization versus an alter globalization or a counter globalization. That has not yet happened. The alter globalization is more a kind of Western imagination still. It has not really happened in the global South. So that's why it's a little more complicated. In purely empirical terms, it's very complicated.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next question is to Professor Üçer, switching to Turkish.
Next question is to Professor İbrahim Halil Üçer. In 19th century, a similar evolution theory is referred to an El-Caiz, published by an article him. So can we also think that they are opposing to this doctrine? So how we can interpret it? I can say two things. Islam, the absolute creating performance of God is another thing. This definition can be wrong. The absolute will or creating something can be a semantical principle, but because it can be a creature, but the basic definition is still God. But Muslim, we cannot. Yes, it is possible to say that Muslims do believe in a God which has an absolute will, but a philosopher can be a philosopher, but he can say that he created it because he created the word, the God created the word because it was compulsory for him. But the philosopher can also reject the other. So you can see the layer here, actually. Basic definition is God, but creating something is the definition which is actually founding this. So this is another point we can say. So it is not a credo of the Islam. You don't need to defend an absolute will because you don't know what do you refer to will, what do you refer to absolute, etc. So the theory of Jahiz and Darwin are different from each other actually. The evolution Jahiz told is actually also spoken by other Islam philosophers, but the common point is that they are close to an evolution within the species. But we can see the same framework also in Avicenna. And thirdly, another Jahiz is a philosopher, a naturalist philosopher. So he is a bit essentialist philosopher. He was the student of Nazam, and Nazam was known as the philosopher of naturalism. So they are not like Darwin's theory, we can say. They are talking about only like Jahiz, for example. So we can say that they can evolve within the spaces, not among the other species. We can say species. Thank you. That's all.
Evet, okudum ben o soruyu. Siz
Another question to Mr. Mehmet Kuyurtar from İbrahim Halil Üçer. Islam philosophers imagined the philosophical truth centered in cosmos, like their ancient Greek colleagues, but they are, we can say, they have had some difficulties about finding a relationship between the truth and the time in terms of human context. This is an ahistoric perspective. History of ideas is a new perspective for us.
perspektifi de yeni bir perspektif. Yani bilim
History of sciences is a different thing for us. So according to science or other points we can say, but so actually as a truth I can say. So yes, they had difficulty about finding a relationship between history and the philosophical truths. Yes, how we can put it like that. Yes, I agree with that. There has been lots of changes that transformed these philosophical discussions and also going away from other philosophical discussions in terms of maths, in terms of creating novum organum, Descartes, Kant, etc. So in terms of method, there were lots of transformations. It was a critical point for the history of the. So this is a thing that the ahistorical thing has something related with following or pursuing the truth. if I know something which is outside my mind, but the thing I know outside my mind is the same, and the criteria of this exact information in my mind cannot change because this thing doesn't change. So maybe you can say that the criteria of the closer information is that it is something that cannot change. It has a characteristic that it will not change. It is changeless. The exact information, the true information is changeless because the object of the information stays there. So this idea actually creates the classical philosophy or the rationalism, we can say. So the thing which made the 17th century so much uncomfortable is actually that one. So this perspective is something I can say is something we have to criticize within the rationalistic perspective. We can confess that. But here, as I would like to refer to Avicenna while talking about this deductive learning. Avicenna says that, for example, even these truths exist, we cannot know. There is a doubt that if this knowledge can be known to us. So we cannot, maybe there is a doubt that we cannot know. There are serious doubts that we cannot know this. If this truth exists, yes, according to him, there are these truths, but we cannot know them via rational methods. What do we know? They exist in the phenomenal stage, we can say. So, according to us, in this point, it offered another method for another deductive learning. Fahrettin el-Razi, actually something we can, even Ibn Sina says, is something what the scientific knowledge know. The thing we say that abduction, the thing we can relate it with abduction, we can say, it is something, the thing we know, an objective point. We actually say that today it is a point that which is the knowledge which is the closest to us. So in terms of this point, we can have to take it. This is another moral discussion. What does it mean? This is an interesting theory. We can say that it is with new arguments, with new observations, we can find a new idea. So the approach of Razi actually influenced a lot about the Islam thought tradition, we can say. It creates, it pushed them to an historical perspective. Ibn Haldun emerges after Razi, so it is a good point to find a new way to tie the historical perspective. And so Ibn Haldun is something we can say el-Mahsar, for example.
İslam düşünce geleneğini sadece meşai gelenek etrafında değerlendirmez. Burada kelam geleneğini, matematik...
We cannot relate with actually only about the point we can say. With this, there are some perspectives which are going out of a historic perspective, we can say. This is a more appropriate position after Razi and Ibn Haldun. For example, in their early works, for example, there is another, it is not like Laricious book. They are also talking about the lies, not the lies, but point instead. And it is a point, the Kelami Tabakat book, I can recommend it for reading that. Thank you so much for your question, Mehmet Hocam. Thank you so much. Next question, I would like to ask to Mr. Adiga. Özgür Soysal is asking to you, Mr. Aditya. You said that the simultaneous ones, which are not simultaneous in the historical perspective, how we can think that in the Marxism discussions in the colonialist, anti-colonialist way. We have a very limited time, so they just need to answer in 2 minutes, Mr. Aditya.
Şu anda...
Yes. No, actually the thing is, yes, it is not a question which we can have a very short answer, but let me just say that throughout the 20th century, we keep noticing this, and it is anybody who has any idea of countries of the global south will acknowledge that it is not our system, our whole, everything is differently structured here. Our democracy is different, our capitalism is different, our modernity is different, and so on. Precisely because there is all this, there are these asynchronous synchronicities. But how to understand that, as long as you think that they are only remnants of the past, then, and that is Marxism's problem, that actually it was never able to overcome that philosophically, which was in some sense the point of resistance, let us say, between people like Julius Nkrumah or in Tanzania, the Nyerere and so on, that they were trying to build what they called African socialism. Why? How? By basically they were saying, look, we have common property here, we have a different kind of structure here, we don't have capitalism, we can't go the same way. So in a way, it was not theorized even there, but at least in those anti-colonial struggles, there was a greater recognition of the specificity of African societies. That was lost somehow in Marxism. Right now, I'll only say this. I think at some point we can have a later discussion.
Biz teşekkür ediyoruz. Öncelikle konuşmacılarımız.
Thank you so much again. We would like to extend our thanks to İbrahim, Halil, Üçer, and Aditya Nigam for their talks. Thank you again, and to thank you again for everyone for organizing this symposium and the question. The other session will start at 8. See you at 8. Thank you so much, Ms. Saniye, and to Aditya and İbrahim, Halil, and thank you so much.
Thank you everybody. Thanks a lot for.
Biz teşekkür ediyoruz sabırla dinlediğiniz için. Sağ olun, var olun.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Çok teşekkür ederiz.
Saniye hocama da teşekkür ediyoruz hususen. Sağ olun. Eyvallah.
And
Teşekkürler.
now we can end this session. Şu anda bu oturumu kapatıyorum. Görüşmek üzere 15 dakika sonra.